ambassador to the United Nations, then committed himself to this task. And he's so committed, he now realized one of the major problems of the environmental issue turned out to be Chinese problem. And so he, from beautiful Canada, relocated himself in Beijing and decided to be part of the totally polluted environment in his 80s. Recently, his doctors advised him to leave for at least 3 months, get the nice air, then come back and suffer the Beijing environment. But he's still struggling face up this kind of question. And some people said in the 20th century or 21st century, the rise of China should also be understood as a momentous event in human history. But I basically disagree. I mentioned I refuse to accept the 1, 2, 3, 4 analysis of the situation. One superpower, they continue to be superpower, that's out of the question. Two different camps, socialism, capitalism, fighting each other, capitalism won, socialism lost. I don't think it is necessarily sustainable. The idea of East Asia, North America, and the European community represent three of the major forces in shaping the human community. I don't accept that either, because India is now emerging, and Russia is very important, and Brazil. And eventually, I'm sure that Indonesia will emerge, and I will even believe that 50 years from now, Africa will be a very important area. So I hope you think pluralistically about the human situation. Many people say this is wishful thinking. Well, I think wishful thinking is more convincing in this case than the idea of 1, 2, 3, 4. The scientists were involved, then a movement. I think it's one of the most important movements in the last 50 years, and it hasn't attracted the attention that it deserves. It's the movement that I mentioned. I asked you to read the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter movement, in the very early phase, I was deeply involved. But the Earth Charter movement is really a popular movement to try to underscore the importance of issues that scientists realize, and some of the more sensitive minds also began to realize. And the Earth movement has been going on for decades. And recently an attempt was made to introduce this to all the college students in China, let them understand the question of the Earth. And Mr. Stephen Rockefeller was a professor of religion at Middlebury, and actually was instrumental in developing this, involving more than 1,000 people trying to contribute, not just simply to promote it, but to shape it, to discuss it. That's why I think it's a very good idea to look at the Earth Charter. It's not just a question of environment narrowly conceived, it's a question about an attitude towards life, the renegotiation of the relationship between human and Earth. Now, all these movements turn out to be very useful for arousing our interest in the problem. But there's something deeper. The scientific solution is at one level, we may have to do it, but the psychocultural reason is also very important. But a deeper level is really an ethical religious question. The ethical religious question was first raised by Lin White in probably 1964. He's a historian. He published a thought-provoking book and first an article on this question of the environmental crisis. And he argued the environmental crisis began with the Genesis of the Bible. The very conception that a human has dominion over the world, or over all the creatures, and is the beginning of human arrogance, or anthropocentrism, or the idea that humans are endowed with incredible power to control the world. he believed that you have to really trace the origins of this environmental crisis to that particular idea. Of course, the assumption is that the environmental crisis is basically created by advanced industries or advanced industrial nations, namely European countries and more recently the United States. And all these societies were under the influence of the Christian ethos. And many theologians then began to reinterpret the idea of dominance. What does it mean? And basically, I think Ling Wai is a bit harsh on one of the spiritual traditions, which means Christianity. And if you look at the Confucian tradition, or the Chinese idea of the ability in a very positive way to solve the problem of the flood, the sage King Yu. On the other hand, you have the notion that human, not just potential, but human power is such that human beings can transform the world. The worst, I think the meaningless case in this story is that the foolish old man wanted to move the mountain. So you can find a number of other examples. Yet, we need to rethink about this problem. The rethinking will have to be at the basic ethical, religious level. Let me ask you a question. I think that is maybe helpful. If you look at the advent of modern civilization, let's just say 100 years or 200 years, what group, we're not talking about individuals, what group suffered the most because of the advent of what we call modern civilization? Modern civilization defined in terms of industrialization, urbanization, the development of science and technology, modern universities, major bureaucracies, multinational corporations. Try to think the group of human beings that suffer the most because of this process.
Native Americans?
Pardon me? Yeah, very. You use the term Native Americans, but you should broaden it to say indigenous peoples. The interesting thing about that, I think it's very revealing, is that indigenous peoples, in terms of their style of life, coexisted with the environment ever since the Neolithic period. They were hunters, food gatherers, they were agriculturists, and they're highly localized. And their relationship to nature continue to be not only peaceful and harmonious, and they manage to live in a very small area, a small community, and continue to flourish before the advent of the modern civilization. The American Indians, of course, the indigenous peoples in America suffered a great deal, but also happened in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in other places like Hawaii. And all the other societies now, Canada is a very good example, but Australia, New Zealand, all begin to feel they did something terrible when they began to recognize the rights and importance of indigenous peoples. U.S. is the only one country is not particularly keen on doing this question, not dealing with this problem, because if they open this area, it is difficult to stop it. Then we want to ask, what are some of the indigenous resources, or some of the human resources, let's say at the ethical or religious level, that should be mobilized in order to deal with this crisis? And, we have to think the situation here and now. If we think about the situation here and now, we need to think about all the resources we'll be able to mobilize in order to deal with all the cultural, spiritual, symbolic resources. And because it's not only a scientific problem, it's not a problem of ethics.